Hey there, Squirrel Army. How's it going? For today, I want to discuss being intentional in your deck choices. You can join the Squirrel Army by subscribing. Alright, so we discussed before how you should perhaps take some advice with grains of salt. This is one. There are some parts that you can say being unintentional does happen anyway to a degree, because sometimes things do happen out of nowhere. But for the most part, I think you don't ever want to not be intentional with the cards that you're choosing for your deck. You want to be intentional for the most part of what you're putting in. Now, will you know every single synergy and every single thing that's going to happen in every single game, along with whatever somebody else's cards are doing at the time in the situation? Perhaps not, but those are things that perhaps you cannot uh, figure out. There's just so much that only so much you can figure out within your deck building process, because you never know what your opponents are going to play, and you never know how cards are going to synergize together with one another and that sort of thing. Especially if you are playing a deck that steals other people's cards, you never know what you're going to get and that sort of thing. So, and again, especially when, let's say, you're facing somebody that has a bad jank deck, or facing a bunch of people that have bad jank decks, like a dice roll deck. Not to say that they're just bad decks in general, but in general, they're not a very powerful deck. They're fun, they're cool, they're amazing at doing what they're doing, but they're a very specific deck. They're not going to really work very well for what you probably want. So being intentional in the game as well is just one of those things of going, well, I know that this person is running this jank, dice roll deck, so there's no point in me trying to take cards away from them, because I'm just going to get all this random dice roll stuff that's not really going to do anything. Then I'm going to have to, roll dice to get mediocre things for the most part. Even if I've got multiple dice roll things, it's not really what I really wanted. I wanted to steal cool, big, fun, or, more generically good stuff to a degree. So knowing that in game as well is one big thing. But knowing that also in the deck construction, being intentional again in saying, well, if I am in a theft deck, I don't want to just be 100% theft. I want to actually have other ways to win and other ways to get advantages, rather than just relying on what my opponents have got at any given moment. Because I can't remember the card right now is it Sepulchral Primordial? I think that's the name. But it's a 6 mana. I can't remember the creature type actually now, but it's a black card that steals cards from opponents' graveyards. There's also the blue Primordial, I think, that basically casts people's instants or sorceries from their graveyards. Now, again, people's graveyards can have stuff in them, but they also can have nothing in them. Like Rise of the Dark Realms, that can be a really powerful card if people actually have anything in their graveyard. So it's not that that's a bad card, but it's very hit and miss. Like Insurrection, same thing. It's a very hit and miss card. If you draw it right after a board wipe's happened, or when your opponents basically have nothing or relatively nothing, or only a few creatures, or only creatures that really don't help you. If you're already in a winning position, it's not really going to help you, or whatever. So those are obvious things, but again, it's just one of those things, being intentional, going, well, how often will this card be a card that is actually worth my time investing in? And that sort of thing. Like, am I going to be the one to be able to take advantage of this? Like, if you put the Monarch in your deck, there has to be a reason why you're kind of putting the Monarch in your deck. Not just, lol, I'll put the Monarch in my deck and we'll see how it all goes. No, this is a set, you're either playing semi-group hug to some extent to put in the Monarch, or you're planning on constantly, getting the Monarch back either by, punching people for the Monarch, or you're, intending on casting a lot of spells that have you become the Monarch on them. And there's not a lot of those, but there is certainly more now. But again, you're sort of diving into that and saying, right, well, this is what I'm doing, and this is where I'm going, and this is what I'm all about. I'm all about the Monarch or whatever. So that really works well for me. Yes, sure, that's really cool. You've got that deck that's all about the Monarch and that sort of thing, but being intentional in that, going, well, how do I get the Monarch back besides just casting something that has Monarch or gives me the Monarch? Or do I want more things to go to people's things? Or do I want the initiative, which is sort of like the Monarch? Do I want more things that are like that so that I can, either be semi-group, even more semi-group huggy, or get even more benefits from when I do steal these things from other people and that sort of thing? I have that deck for myself. I have a deck that's focused around, all these sort of weird helper mechanics that, have come out in the past few years. That was a very intentional choice to build that deck. So that was an interesting build for me. And making those choices about building that deck was very, very fun. And again, being intentional, going, yes, I could put certain cards in here as well, like Dockside, but I found that Dockside wasn't very good. It was very hit and miss, even though my commander made clues for, each of my opponents could make clues when it came in, but those opponents usually would crack those clues pretty quickly. So even if I had it sometimes on turn 2, which was very rare, I think it only happened once, then it was not very good for the most part the rest of the time, because my opponents often wouldn't have many artifacts or enchantments on the field, perhaps because I was playing a lot of green decks, because green's one of the most popular colors in the format and one of the most powerful colors in the format. But still, it's just one of those things that you kind of go, well, intentionally, looking back at this card, yes, it's really powerful in certain decks and it works with the theme, but it just doesn't work for the deck, even though it kind of synergizes with the commander. So it's just one of those things that, I decided to take out. And same with Smothering Tithe. That was this is a very good card, but 9 times out of 10, I forget about it. And it gets too annoying if I do remember it. I don't want to be being reminded for Smothering Tithe, so I don't want to have to remind my opponents for the Smothering Tithe. Plus, it was a pretty expensive card still, so I could get some decent money out of it and get other cards that I did need and were less oppressive and less, just less of a big target and that sort of thing. Because, again, sometimes, this is one thing that I think has come up a lot, that is, the bigger of a target something is, in a sense, the less you kind of want it to a degree as well. Because, again, those good cards sometimes fall into that trap of being too big of a target. So you might go, well, this is not quite as good of a card, but it will do an approximation of that card, and it won't be so annoying that people will, focus on it or take it away from me. So sometimes making those choices of going, well, for this particular moment and for this particular deck, this is a very slow deck and whatnot for the most part. So why not lean more into that fact that the deck is already pretty slow? You're not going to get many more benefits from trying to increase your pace in that regard anyway, because again, the deck is already slow, so just adding a couple of fast cards doesn't really add very much to that strategy. So knowing that and knowing, well, might as well put in cards that are a little bit less of a target, because again, people won't really respond to them for that much because they're like, well, it's not Smothering Tithe or it's not Dockside, so I don't think we need to super worry about it. It's just giving me a little bit of value and whatnot and that sort of thing here and there. And perhaps, yes, you could argue the opposite to say, well, actually what you really want to do is just go full ham and just like try to win as fast as possible, or try to put the pedal to the metal per se in that deck, even though it's a fairly slow deck for the most part anyway. You just want to put on the gas. So even if you have cards like Dockside that was pretty inconsistent, so I just thought, wow, even there's other inconsistent cards that'll probably do some amount of that sort of work. So I just sort of thought, well, intentionally I'll make that choice to change the direction of the deck, or not the direction of the deck, but some of the card choices within that deck. So again, I was very intentional with that deck. When I decided, or when I was playing both of my Selesnya decks at the time, I made this conscious, deliberate decision on how to build them. But I soon found out that the decks did not work in the way that I wanted them to work. I have went through this before, but the +1/+1 counters deck really could not get enough bodies on the field for me to buff. I had all these things that would buff things, but just nowhere to really put all those buffs. Whereas my tokens deck would put out a whole bunch of tokens and then have no real ways to buff those tokens or make them scary or make them threatening. So I was like intentionally thinking, how can I, solve the problem of this deck needing more force the token deck needing more force multipliers, and the counters deck needing more forces to put those multipliers on. So the solution was pretty obvious, to put in all the sort of token generating stuff into the counters deck and to put more of the counters making stuff into the tokens deck, so that the tokens deck would have more bite and have more power and be more scary, and that the counters deck would have more bodies on which to put all of the counters that it could generate, and that sort of thing. So that really worked out well intentionally for those when I made that choice, when I noticed that those issues were kind of coming up in the deck. But that could have been something that if I had intentionally thought about it a little bit more and thought, how does this deck work and how does it win? How does it, get off the ground? You're doing all these cool things that are on this theme, but that's not really helping you get to the point of going, how do I generate enough damage, or how do I find a way to kill people at the end of the day? You could be running some random combo of 2 cards and whatever, or some Voltron strategy or whatever else you want to do. Again, I get that, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I wanted to figure it out. It was a pretty simple solution, but again, it was just that, again, trying to go back to being intentional. What is the purpose of the deck, or what is the goal of the deck in the end of the day? It doesn't really matter what the goal of the deck is in that sense, because the goal of the deck, like if it's a tokens deck, you're still generating tokens. But now it's more about, buffing those tokens in some way by +1 counters or by whatever. Mostly +1 counters. But again, that was the idea. You make tokens, you buff them, you hit people, and you kill them. The counters deck, again, same thing. You're putting counters on things. But the problem is, like as I said, where are you putting all those counters? If you've got nothing to put those counters on, or if you've only got these big 6/6, 7/7, 8/8, whatever creatures, already it's like, well, they're already really big, so there's no point really in trying to buff them up even more because they're already really, really big for the most part. Yes, most of them, some of them didn't have evasion, but most of them did, I think. So again, having that deck have more ways to generate bodies and having more ways to, distribute all those counters that you could put on things was just a better way of, figuring out how the deck would actually play throughout the game and get towards its win condition of killing people. So that's what I mean by you being intentional in a way. And sometimes it does take playing decks sometimes and going, well, actually, this does not work for what I was thinking it would work. Like you're saying, I want to build a tokens deck. Well, that's a cool idea and a cool story and that, but you can't just build a tokens deck. You've got to figure out, okay, well, what colors am I in? If I have red, then maybe I want, Perforos. Maybe I want Impact Tremors. Maybe I want those sorts of things because I need ways to, hit my opponents for damage and kill them somehow. So I need, or I need ways to buff my creatures, or I need to, again, find ways to make those creatures threatening in some way, or, win the game with those creatures that I'm generating. If they're not, finding me a way to win the game, then what am I doing? Like, you're just playing stuff for the sake of playing it, Like, and yes, again, like, you could have a more janky deck and you could just slap 100 cards into sleeves and shuffle up and play. That's 100% fine. But when you're trying to build a deck for, a Precon Plus or pre-upgraded Precon Plus style metagame, which is like, becoming more and more of the metagame in EDH nowadays, is you've got to be intentional about what you're playing. You can't just play anything and not really have that game plan. You don't have to have it 100% in mind, but you have to be going through that process of going, am I going to put this in over this, or why am I going to put this in over this? Like, a lot of my decks revolve around creatures because I'm an aggro player for the most part, and I have moved away from everything has to 100% be aggro and have to do everything with creatures or creature-based, damage. So I've moved into saying, well, things like Perforos and Impact Tremors and things like that and Life Drain and things like that, those are okay, and whatnot, but still you've got to find those things that work for you personally. If you're a person who likes combos, cool, like, again, you've got to have other things in your deck. You can't just sit there and say, I'm going to hope that I draw a board wipe or whatever, or I hope, that the Cranko player doesn't kill me before I can find my combo or whatever. You need to be running Ghostly Prison. You need to be running, these things that protect you if you're playing a slower deck, or Teferi's Protection or whatever else it is. You need to be finding ways to say, okay, how am I going to gain life against some of these other strategies? Because how can I stay in the game for longer if I'm not, gaining that life against a deck that is very, very, heavy on these Impact Tremors, Perforos style effects and that sort of thing. So you've again got to weigh that sort of thing up and think, well, how am I going to deal with this, or how am I going to, combat that? And again, that's another intentional part of deck building, is running the sorts of, in general, removal and whatnot that, will affect decks that perhaps you need to deal with out there. Because again, you're never going to know what you're going to face, but there's a whole bunch of typical things that you will face, like graveyard strategy. Even decks that aren't full-on graveyard decks are often playing things out of their graveyard. A lot of green decks have Eternal Witness. A lot of white decks have Sun Titan or Sun Titan style effects. So again, there's a lot of decks that are out there that kind of do stuff with their graveyards anyway. It might not be, game winning and game breaking, but it's still good value to kind of do that. And certainly I would recommend people to run more sort of graveyard recursion sort of things if you can, as well, because it is well worth it. It's always well worth to get cards back, especially when you can choose what they are. But still, it's one of those things. Running that bit of grave hate is an intentional choice. Saying, yes, I will run this Tormod's Crypt or whatever else it is, because I know that graveyard decks exist in the format, or I am going to run Leyline of the Void, or whatever else it is, or I am going to run a Rest in Peace, again, because I know those decks exist. So I want some way to deal with those decks, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. Yes, some of those effects might shut down my graveyard as well, and I might make myself sad about that, but the fact is, if I have the choice between losing versus, oh, well, I don't get to use my graveyard, well, I'm going to take the choice of, well, I don't get to use my graveyard and just hope that I can hang on throughout the game without needing my graveyard, because at that point, again, I would rather be able to play the game and still try to win rather than just lose because I wasn't packing any graveyard hate or whatever. So again, that's one of those things that you've got to kind of look at and go, well, I need grave hate, or I need to find ways to, make sure that I'm not losing to this person, even if this person's got a more janky deck of a graveyard deck. I don't want to lose to them. And if you play the graveyard deck, same thing. You've kind of got to do the opposite as well. You've got to try to protect your graveyard, because you know that that's your one big weakness if people exile your graveyard. Now, there's not that much that you can do sometimes, but again, you've got to try to find those things that can mitigate you losing that graveyard. Because otherwise, again, once somebody does exile your graveyard, your game is pretty much over, and you're sat there with little to no defenses and little to no strategy, and then everyone can kind of wail on you and take you out of the game. So again, you need to find ways to, protect it, shuffle it back into your library, even though that's not the best, but still, at least then it's in your library, and maybe you'll be able to find something else to start the chain again at some point. So, or shuffle effects like fetch lands and things like that. So again, you need to be intentional and know, right, well, I'm playing this deck, I'm playing this Voltron deck or whatever else it is. So my one weakness is people, straight up just knowing that I'm playing Voltron and killing my commander before I get to either to do anything, because, hey, they know I'm playing Voltron, so they know that if they don't stop it before I really can get going, then the game's over for me, because I need, a few quick turns just to kill everyone pretty much as quickly as possible, because otherwise I really can't do anything. But in that scenario, it's like, well, what else can they do? They either shut me down or they just lose. So, as I say, being intentional, I've got to run, because I've probably got one creature, my commander, again, that really matters. So running a lot more protection is, much more worth it. Again, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of protection spells. If you run one or two, that's fine or whatever. But for the most part, those decks need to run a lot of protection. And I see too many of those decks just running a lot of stuff that does not protect the commander, or does not keep the commander, in mind so that you can get it back, or whatever, if it does die or whatever, or you have an alternate game plan or whatever, because again, it's all built around, well, I hope nobody's got anything. Oh shit, they had something, and then you're out of the game or whatever, or you're out of the game for long enough, or people police you long enough again for, you to effectively do nothing. So knowing that ahead and knowing, okay, well, I've got to mitigate that. I've got to find, I've got to be in white or blue or whatever to a degree because I need access to, counter spells, or I need access to, you know, a lot of protection spells, and that sort of thing, or I might need to be in green for the indestructible hexproof style spells and that sort of thing. So that's one of those things you need to know. Okay, this is what I'm doing, and this is my intention with what I'm doing, because this is where it's all going. This is these are the pitfalls of this strategy, or these are the pitfalls of playing against other people. You'll never know what you're going to get, but if you prepare for most things, or the most sort of common things that are out there, like graveyards again, then you'll be much well off. Like I said before, I think I said this before in a video, that running removal that is generic is good because you will get anything for the most part. But honestly, when you think about it, what are the top things that are in the format that people play in their decks? Creatures, artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, and lands, and that's about it. Like, there's only so many types that people actually, play on the most part. So you really need to be able to deal with those types. So planeswalkers you can probably cut out if you're playing any kind of creature deck, unless they're comboing off for the most part. Then you just need counter spells. And you need to know that they're just like, oh, I'm going to play 5 million planeswalkers with doubling season out, and I'm going to ult every single one of them and take 5 million turns, and then the game's over. Okay, cool story. Whatever, you need to know those people that have those decks, and you need to be like, well, I'm not really going to play against that deck unless I'm playing with this deck, because this is the only deck that really has a chance to beat it, or to at least stay in the game against it, because it just goes off way too quickly and too easily, and there's often not a lot that I can do about that. So I need to play with this deck against that deck. But again, knowing that is half the battle to a degree, and sometimes you get caught. But again, intending to, be able to play against mostly creatures, artifacts, and enchantments, and maybe lands, again, you should weight your deck to being able to remove artifacts, enchantments, and creatures, and perhaps even lands, So I wouldn't really run much like board wipe based land destruction, because I don't think there's any that doesn't affect you unless you're running Teferi's Protection or anything like that anyway. So I don't really see the point in really running mass destruction, especially when it's usually only 1 or 2 lands that come up here and there that are worth destroying anyway. So, you might as well just run, your demolition fields or your ghost quarters or whatever else you're going to run in those land slots, because it's a much smaller requirement to have to run it in a land slot. And especially with something like demolition field, at least when you destroy their land, you get a land back, so you don't really lose out on a land. Yeah, they get a land too, but at least they only have a basic now. So, and even, again, perhaps they'll get that land back, but again, perhaps you can get your demolition field back, or your ghost quarter back, or whatever else it is. But again, I don't like the lands that drop you down a land unless you've got lots of ways to recur that land. Like, just playing strip mine over and over again from your graveyard is very, very gross. but it's just one of those things that, like if you're playing it against a deck that, is doing that much, sort of terrible, horrible stuff with their lands, then perhaps it's kind of warranted or whatever. Because again, you're just trying to stop them from, kind of doing the degenerate things that you don't want them to do. So again, knowing that is half the battle. Again, sort of, we've said this many times, to an extent, removal saves you from losing the game. And, that's one of those things, like, you just need to do it. It's one of those things that, like, one for one removal feels bad in a sense if you think about it, because it's a multiplayer format and I just used my resources and Steve didn't use any of his and then Katie didn't use any of hers or whatever. But, like if we were going to lose, then you're kind of like going, well, I need to stop myself from losing. Like, or at a certain point, you can be like, hey, we've had some fun. I could stop this, especially with some players. Like, it depends what's going on. But again, or with some decks. But again, mostly you don't want to just give up and lose. Like, you want to keep playing unless the game's been going for 3 or 4 hours or whatever it is. And then you might be like, hey, let's wrap this up. I might have a removal, but I don't care. It's time for this game to be over. Let's shuffle up and play again. But that's that intentional part of, usually it won't be like that. Usually, you're intending not to have that happen and not have had the game draw out that long or whatever. But sometimes it does happen. But again, you just need to always be intentional with everything that you're kind of doing, because if you don't know, kind of like, this is always one of those things that this is another reason why I don't let people borrow my decks and I don't borrow people's decks, because I don't know what their decks do and I don't really trust other people to kind of know what my deck does either, for the most part. So it's like, well, it's a very nuanced deck, so you really need to know what you're kind of doing. You need to understand the timing of it. You need to understand that, this is sort of a human tribal deck or whatever, and you need to realize, oh yeah, this is at instant speed and this and that, and remember how things work and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's lots of little things to figure out whether or not, is this worth it or whatever, that sort of thing. Depends. But again, this is one of those things. But anyway, guys, I think, you guys get the point about this. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it for whatever part of this that you have listened to. If you've made it all the way to the end here, thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. You can tell me what you guys think. Write your thoughts down there in the comments below. Hope you will join me again in another one.